The other day, my son and I were watching an old horror movie on TV. During one of the scenes, he asked me what the scariest thing to ever happen to me was. I thought for a moment and smiled down at him. I told him that it was the day I decided to marry his mother. He just groaned, stating that getting married isn't scary at all. I just rubbed his head and told him that it was time for bed. While my son thought I was just making another dad joke, I wasn't lying, not by a long shot, but he was much too young to hear the real story. After putting him to bed, I thought back to that night and my long walk home. I've decided to write the story down, a story I've never told anyone, while the memory is still at the forefront of my mind. Way back when my wife and I first started dating, we both lived in a sleepy little rural town. At the time, I was commuting to and from the city for work. The trip sucked. Not to mention my father had given me his beater of a truck for a birthday present. Might sound like I'm ungrateful, but you gotta understand. Most of my paycheck went right into keeping that thing running. I can't tell you how many summers that truck had broken down on me. The day it happened started out like any other. I had gotten ready for work, and when I stepped outside to hop into my truck, I noticed that it was unusually cold outside. Although it was the tail end of summer, a chill like this was uncommon. I shivered slightly as I zipped up my hoodie before hopping into the truck. Taking a moment to breathe some warmth into my hands, I turned the key and the ignition just squealed. I tried again. Nothing. I then slammed my fist onto the steering wheel, cursing this bucket of bolts. And then on the third time, the engine sputtered to life. I quickly turned on the heater and began my drive to work. The drive to work was a long one. It was nearly an hour and a half each way. Although I lived in a little town, the road connecting to the city itself was a long and desolate one. On either side of the road were vast fields that reached out into nearby forests. This scenery went on for miles before the outskirts of the city slowly came into view. I never did like driving on that road. I couldn't tell you why, as it was just a weird feeling I had in my gut. Regardless, work was work, and I made that drive anyway. Every day. I arrived at work without issue, and everything seemed normal. I was just about to finish my shift when my boss had asked me to stay a few hours late. He said I'd make overtime for it and I needed the money, so I agreed. My shift dragged into the night, and I didn't leave until around 11 p.m. As I stepped out into the parking lot, that chill I felt earlier only seemed to have worsened. I rubbed my hands together as my body trembled slightly. I jogged over to my truck and hopped inside. I held my breath as I turned the key, and much to my surprise, the truck started on the very first go. A smile crept onto my face as I pulled out of the parking lot and began my journey home. Driving through the city, there were hardly any other cars on the road. This made navigating the streets much easier. Around 20 minutes of driving, I had reached the outskirts of the city. Turning onto that long stretch of road, I noticed a thin layer of fog beginning to form along the edges of the fields. I kept a close eye on the road in front of me and continued driving. 15 minutes had passed since I had pulled onto that road, when suddenly, a loud noise boomed from under the truck's hood. Immediately following that sound, the momentum in the truck slowed, causing me to lurch forward. I began belting out profanities and the truck gingerly rolled onto the shoulder of the road. A thick layer of steam was seeping out of the edges of the hood, which seemed to almost meld with the fog outside. I sighed and rested my head on the steering wheel for a moment. After mentally preparing myself, I shoved open the door and stepped outside. I used my sleeves to crack the hood open, and a mess of steam and smoke came pouring out of it. There was no way I was going to fix this, especially not with how late it was. I looked back in the direction of the city, which I could no longer see, then down the road towards home. Unfortunately, this took place in a time before cell phones, so I was unable to simply call for a tow truck. My only option was to walk. In my haze of driving, I thought I had been driving on the road for quite a while, and that my town was only a short trek away. I locked up my truck, zipped up my hoodie, and began walking. If any of you have ever walked along an empty road in the middle of the night, alone, then I'm sure you're aware of just how eerie that can be. On top of that, the thin layer of fog had started to become more pronounced as time went on. Between the dark and the fog, I would often find my eyes catching sight of things that weren't truly there, various shapes obscured in the distance before fading entirely. As I walked, the temperature seemed to fluctuate. One moment it'd be freezing, almost to the point of numbing my entire body. Then the next it'd be sweltering, and I'd have to unzip my hoodie to get some respite. Eventually, as I continued, I saw something in the distance. The fog slightly parted as I approached. It looked to be a car on the side of the road. I could feel a knot beginning to form in my throat as I drew closer. It wasn't a car. It was my truck. I stared with disbelief as the frame became more apparent. This was impossible, as I had been walking in a straight line since I had started. Suddenly, as I was within 20 feet, I heard something coming from the other side of it. It sounded like crying. A low wailing sob met my ears, though I couldn't see where it was coming from. I reached the rear of the truck and rested a hand on the tailgate just to be sure that it was really there. It was. As I walked around the side of it, the crying seemed to get louder and louder. I leaned my head around the front of the truck and saw something, sitting off on the side of the road. It appeared to be a person, clutching their knees to their chest and sobbing uncontrollably. I wasn't sure what to do. A part of my mind was telling me not to approach, while another part was urging me to help. Instead, I simply called out to whoever it was and asked them if they were all right. As soon as a sound left my lips, the crying ceased instantly. The silence that filled the void was palpable. I looked around to make sure nothing else was around before asking once again. Then, a new sound began to cut through that silence. It was so loud it seemed like it would carry on for miles. It was the sound of bones cracking and dislocating. I watched as whatever this was began to stand up. When I thought it had finished standing, I was wrong. It continued to grow even more larger, the popping of bones into sockets becoming slower. It had to have been around 12 feet tall. It turned around to face me, and I instinctively screamed. It was horrifying. It wore no clothing. It was just smooth gray skin from head to toe. Its body seemed to almost blend with the fog drifting around us. Its head was unsettling. Just seeing something with an upside-down face was enough to send a paralyzing fear throughout my body. Its face didn't look natural either, and not just because of its orientation. It was as if the face didn't truly belong to it, as if it had been stolen. It let out a gasping shriek in my direction, and I stumbled back into my truck. A sound like the ripping of fabric could be heard as the creature before me began to change. It convulsed and twitched as it stood there. When it was finished, it had sprouted 5 new arms out from its body. It was wholly a walking nightmare. My entire body was shaking as I struggled to back away from it. The creature outstretched a hand towards me, and the fingers barely grazed my cheek before I reeled back. I ran over to my truck and was nervously trying to unlock it. My hand shook so violently that I dropped my keys in the dirt below my feet as the creature slowly lumbered around my truck. I did the only other thing I could think of in that situation, and that was to run. I ran past that thing, dodging another outstretched hand, and down the road for as long as I could. I had been running for so long my lungs were on fire and my legs were screaming. Eventually, My sprint turned into a jog, then the jog turned into a walk. I gasped and wheezed the entire time. Despite my exhaustion, I maintained a brisk pace as I could faintly hear the sounds of shuffling behind me. Whether it was the creature or something else, I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to find out. Just when I thought my legs were going to give out on me, I saw a break in the distance. The fog gave way to various buildings. I had finally made it back to town. I made it home. Although my entire body was aching, I found some renewed energy to lightly jog the rest of the way home. The next day, I called a tow truck and my girlfriend gave me a lift out to where I had parked my truck. The fog had lifted completely, and I managed to find my keys in the dirt where I had dropped them. Even though she had to be at work soon, I asked her if she would stay with me until the tow truck arrived, and without hesitation, she said, "I'm not going anywhere." That was the very moment I knew I would marry her. I don't know what exactly happened that night, or why I've neglected to tell anyone this story for so long. I guess I just wanted it to be a nightmare to forget, a story lost to time. But I doubt that will ever happen. I doubt I will ever truly forget that terrible night and that long walk home.